Good evening, everyone. Thank you for logging into our program tonight. My name is Lauren Gilbert. I'm the Senior Manager for Public Services at the Center for Jewish History. If you'd like to sign up for any of the upcoming programs that you saw in the slideshow, you can do so at our website, which is cjh.org. Please note that the chat function is disabled for participants, so you can put your questions in the Q&A box. We will get to your questions at the end, but you can type them in as we go along. Today's program is being recorded and should be available on the center's webpage and YouTube page within a couple of weeks. And if you registered for the event, you'll receive an email with a link to the recording. If you want to view the automated live captions for this program, please click on the CC button at the bottom of your screen. Tonight's program will be wrapped up in about an hour. Our speaker will give a presentation, and after that, he'll take some of your questions. I'd also like to thank Greenlight Bookstore in Brooklyn. They are offering signed copies of Under Jerusalem in conjunction with this event. If you would like a signed copy, make sure to indicate that in the comments at checkout, and you probably received the link in your confirmation email, but we can put it in the chat once again so you'll have it. I think that's about it. We'll get started. Let me introduce our author tonight. Andrew Lawler is the author of 3 books, including the one we're talking about tonight, Under Jerusalem, the Buried History of the World's Most Contested City, as well as The Secret Token, Myth, Obsession, and the Search for the Lost Colony of Roanoke, which was a national bestseller, and Why Did the Chicken Cross the World? The Epic Saga of the Bird That Powers Civilization. As a journalist, he has written more than 1,000 newspaper and magazine articles from more than 24 countries. His byline has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, National Geographic, Smithsonian, and many others. He is a contributing writer for Science and a contributing editor for Archaeology. Andrew's work has appeared several times in the Best of Science and Nature Writing. So thanks for joining us tonight, Andrew.
Thank you very much,
I
Lauren.
will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Lauren, and it's a pleasure to be here. Virtual is almost as good as in person. So first, I do want to thank the Center for Jewish History for putting this on, as well, of course, as Greenlight Bookstore. And I want to encourage you to support your local bookstores because they've been through a rough time, and I've been going to a lot of them, both virtually and in person, during my book tour. And I'm happy to see most of them have survived, but they really could use your help. So with that, let's start talking about Jerusalem. Now, I'm going to show a PowerPoint that has some tremendous images, most of which were taken by a photographer named Simon Norfolk, who worked for National Geographic. I was with Simon in Jerusalem for 2 or 3 years as we were probing beneath the surface. So I just want to acknowledge him, and I hope you'll enjoy some of these tremendous pictures that he took that will go along with my talk. And then at the end, as Lauren mentioned, I'm really happy to take questions, would love to get a conversation going about what it is I found and maybe things that I don't know that you could tell me about. So with that, I will share my screen. And there we go. So this is one of the images that Simon took. And I really like to begin by talking about where Jerusalem is. Now, if we were in person, I would say, could everybody raise their hand who's been to Jerusalem? And I bet a good half of the audience, of this audience in particular, would raise their hands. But just because there may be some people who are geographically challenged, like I sometimes am, I think we just start with the basics here so that we know what we're talking about and where. So here's a satellite image, and we'll start to zone in on the Middle East, of course. And as we come in, you'll see on the left the Nile River, that little snaky green area. To the right is Mesopotamia, or today's Iraq. And now we're coming down to the Judean highlands. There's the Dead Sea on the right. And we're coming down smack dab, boom, right on top of what is one of the most important places on the globe. And that is not just the old city of Jerusalem, but also the Temple Mount, as it's known to Jews, and the Noble Sanctuary, as it's known to Muslims. It's essentially the Acropolis of the old city. So I might use the term Acropolis or Temple Mount or Noble Sanctuary interchangeably. So as you can see, this is a very rugged place. Now we're going to the next slide. Of course, as I'm sure everybody knows, Jerusalem is famous because it is important to three major faiths. At the bottom, of course, you have the Western Wall that is sacred to Jews. To the right, at the bottom, you have the Dome of the Rock, which is the third holiest site in Islam, which sits on top of that Acropolis. We saw it earlier, that golden dome. And then at the top right, you see this fantastic image that Simon took at great danger to his life on Easter, where you have people celebrating the resurrection of Jesus, and that's the traditional tomb of Jesus at the bottom there, in the center of the image. But keep in mind that Jerusalem has more than three faiths at work here, and these three famous sites. There are also countless shrines and tombs, and virtually every inch of the old city and its environs are filled with places considered sacred by someone, either from one faith or from all three faiths. And one of the peculiar aspects of Jerusalem is, if you've been there, you know, there's no port, there's no river. It doesn't seem like it's a major crossroads. It seems a little remote. And this just gives you a feel for the reason why Jerusalem is there is really because of these shrines and the faiths that have attached importance to this place over the past millennia. Now, to give those of you who have not been to Jerusalem a sense of the scale, if you look to your left, that's of course Central Park and the reservoir. You could almost drop the old city, which here I'll use my cursor here. If you can see, there's the outline of the walls of today's old city. Here's the Acropolis, Temple Mount, and you could almost drop this old city into the reservoir. So this is a very, very confined space where all of this history has gone on. Now, one of the peculiar things that I didn't know when I first started visiting Jerusalem years ago is that unlike many cities in the Middle East, it sits not on just earth, but on limestone. And as a result, the water has trickled through and created all kinds of caves and passages beneath the city. Now, at the same time, there's not much timber in Jerusalem. This is a very rugged area that doesn't get a lot of rainfall, at least for half of the year. So Jerusalem is not just rugged, it also lacks timber. And as a result, the only building material of practical use was stone, that is limestone. And there's something really magic about the stone of Jerusalem. And it's not just that golden color that those of you who have been know so well. When the sun shines toward the end of the day on the walls, it takes on that golden hue. It's also very soft when it's quarried, but it hardens when you bring it up above the earth. So as a result, for millennia, people have used this special stone to build Jerusalem. And to do that, you needed arches that you didn't have timber. And arches are very, very powerful, very strong, and even earthquakes have trouble toppling them. So Jerusalem was built up over the millennia with these arches. Sometimes they were originally built as cisterns. They were turned into other uses, sometimes into sewers. So these spaces have been used over and over again and then added to over the millennia. This is what makes subterranean Jerusalem so fascinating and so different from places like, say, Rome or Paris. And there's a quote from Charles Warren, who we'll talk about, saying essentially that Jerusalem is built arch upon arch, and as a result, the holy city never sleeps. And here you can see in this map, you can see the topography. I wanted to show you the topography before the city developed, and some of these hills are still there. If you've ever walked up the Via della Rosa, you know that. And here's Mount Moriah, also the Temple Mount, or the area known as the Noble Sanctuary for Muslims. Here's Eastern Hill. Here's the only water source, the Yun Spring. It's the only permanent water source in this area, and that is part of the reason why Jerusalem is there. Now, to give you a sense of the weirdness beneath the city, many of you who visited have likely gone to the Western Wall tunnels or to other underground places that are open to tourists. But I was staying for a while in the Christian quarter, and I used to go to a store every day or every other day to do my shopping. And one day the Muslim shopkeeper said to me, "Who are you? You're not a tourist. You've been here too long. What are you up to?" And I told him, and he laughed. And he went over to the potato chip aisle, which you'll see the bottom left there, and lifted up that hatch and then went right down it. I didn't quite know what to do, so I decided to put my groceries down and follow him into what turned out to be a vast Crusader hall. This was no ordinary basement beneath a shop. This was an enormous hall built by the Crusaders that butted up against the Holy Sepulchre, the traditional place where Jesus was crucified and buried. Now, I learned later that the shopkeeper and the Coptic monks who lived next door had a pitched battle over who owned this. And eventually that turned into a 20-year legal battle that involved, of course, Israeli judges, mostly Jewish judges, as well as lawyers. So it gives you an idea of how complicated it is beneath the city. That here you have a Muslim shopkeeper who's arguing with Christian monks in a situation that's adjudicated by Jewish judges. So this gives you a sense of the richness and also the conflict that's happening beneath the city. All right, so this is going to be our one slide of Jerusalem's history, because I don't want to go into great detail about this because many of you know some of this history, and this is not the focus of my book, but it's really good background to have before we launch into the main agenda here. So very briefly, you can think of Jerusalem and its 5 millennia of history in 3 big blocks. The first block begins around 3000 BC. This is the time when the first cities are arising in Egypt and Mesopotamia on either side of the Holy Land. And for those 2,000 years that follow, you have a range of peoples, Bronze Age peoples, Egyptians coming through, conquering the area. You have Canaanites. You have a number of people who are living in this area, about which we don't know a whole lot. Really, it's the Biblical Millennium, which is that period after 1000 BC. This is the time when the Israelites arrive in Jerusalem, conquer the city, and make it the capital of what becomes known as Judea. So in this period, up until 70 CE, that's the point where the Romans destroy Jerusalem. This city is in the middle of everything that's going on during these very exciting times in the Iron Age and into Roman times. So you have not just Judeans living there, you also have Assyrians moving through, you have Babylonians, you have Greeks, you have Romans. So there's a lot of movement of peoples during this complicated era. And this is the period in which most scholars believe that the Hebrew Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament, was written, and mostly in Jerusalem. Now, this all changed when the Romans destroyed the city in 70 CE. Essentially, the old city was gone, and they quickly rebuilt it, turned it into a Roman city. And from there, you have a very different history where you have Romans living there, Persian invaders, and then the Byzantines, who were essentially a Romanized Christians, who turned this into a very important city in the Middle East. And then later, of course, in the 7th century, you have the arrival of Muslims for the first time from the Arabian Peninsula. And then you have the Crusaders that come in, of course, in the Middle Ages. And then around 1500, the Ottomans, who are a Turkic-speaking people based in Istanbul, they take over this area. And for the next 500 years, Jerusalem and the whole area around it is controlled by the Ottomans until the very end of World War I. So there you go. I promise one slide with 5 millennia of Jerusalem's history. So now let's get on to the main task here, and that is to look at how Jerusalem became the Jerusalem it is today. We tend to think of Jerusalem as a place that's always been controversial and contested, but that's not strictly true. It really wasn't until the 1860s that the race to rediscover and control biblical Jerusalem began. And this is what fascinated me, because I write about archaeology, and when I went to Jerusalem many years ago, I went on a tour with an Israeli archaeologist, and they kept mentioning the names of these Western explorers I never heard of, people like Warren or Bliss and Dickey. And so I became interested in the predecessors of today's archaeologists. And this is what led me to explore this thread of how Jerusalem first came to be excavated, and then to discover, to my surprise, the tremendous impact it has had on the city today. And it began with this very peculiar guy named Félicien de Zolzy. He was a friend of Napoleon III, who was the French emperor at the time, nephew of the famous Napoleon. And he got permission from the Ottomans, who ruled in Istanbul, to dig in Jerusalem. It was the first legal dig where he actually had a license to excavate. And he chose this site, the bottom right. It's called the Tomb of the Kings. You can visit it today. It's a tremendous tomb. It's really the most beautiful tomb and the most impressive tomb in Jerusalem. And he, inside, deep beneath this tomb, found a room that had been sealed off. And within that room, he found a sarcophagus, which is pictured there. And inside that sarcophagus, he found the remains of a royal woman, clearly somebody of royal birth. There was gold thread in it. And clearly with this fancy coffin and this fancy tomb, it was clear she was somebody of great importance. Now, he declared that this was an ancient Judean queen and hauled this off to the Louvre, where it created an international sensation. If you remember King Tut back in the 1970s, it was an even bigger sensation, because for the first time, people could go to a museum and see remnants of the biblical past. And this was big news. But at the same time, the Jewish community in Jerusalem was infuriated, because from their perspective, this was simple desecration of a Jewish tomb. And they complained to London, to Paris. They tried to put pressure on the emperor, but the emperor didn't really pay much attention, and the Ottomans weren't interested because they were more interested in keeping a good relationship with the French, which at the time, France was one of the most powerful empires on earth. So from the beginning, you can see that archaeology was not just about science, it was about something more. It was about politics and religion. Now, the British, who were the great rivals of the French in the mid-19th century, were not going to allow the French to dig up biblical Jerusalem. So they launched their own effort, and they got funding from everybody from Queen Victoria to Charles Darwin donated in this effort to find what lay beneath the city. And here's some of the characters. We'll talk in detail about this person at the center, the one with the kind of the short hair here and the beard. His name is Charles Warren, and he was one of the great explorers and controversial figures in Jerusalem's history. So Charles Warren went into these underground passages, many of which had been blocked, most of which, such as this one here at the bottom left, was filled with sewage. He had to boat down this little narrow passage. And you can see how high up it goes. That's the street above. So these are tremendous spaces that had never been mapped before. And Warren did an incredible job in doing that. He managed to get into places that people even today have almost never gotten into, including the Great Sea, the bottom right, which is beneath the Temple Mount of the Noble Sanctuary. This is this vast cave, partly natural and partly hewn to contain water that very few people in our century have seen. But Warren was able to map all of this, and for the first time to give people a clear sense of the subterranean world of Jerusalem. Now, at the same time, he was using gunpowder, because in order to get through some of these passages that were blocked, he had to blow things up. Now, this did not exactly endear him to the Muslim Arabs in Jerusalem, partly because they were fearful that this British heretic was in the business of trying to destroy one of their sacred sites. So there were constant complaints. But the Ottomans, again, the Ottomans who controlled Jerusalem, their interest was in maintaining good relations with the European powers. So they tended to look the other way. Now, these protests were quite formal. The Abu Saud family, you can see their compound here in this pre-1967 photo. Here's the Western Wall, then called the Wailing Wall, and this is the Abu Saud compound. Warren was digging beneath them and was causing destruction to their foundations, according to the family. And they complained to the British Crown, which basically ignored their plea. And the city council also determined that Warren was digging beneath and was threatening to bring down the very court of the Jerusalem court. So there were growing tensions between, not just between the Arabs and the Christians, the European Christians, but also with the Ottoman rulers who were allowing this to happen. And this has a big impact on what will happen in the following century. Now, just briefly, I'll mention that one of the big questions roiled academia back in the 1880s was this question of where Jesus was crucified and buried. According to the Gospels, he was crucified and buried outside of the city walls. Jewish law would not allow people to be buried within city walls. So many Protestants who arrived in Jerusalem believed that this place was a fake, that the Holy Sepulchre, which sits here almost in the middle of or toward the center of the old city, was actually, it wasn't true, that the tradition had no basis in fact. But that changed because a fascinating character named Conrad Schick, who became a famous architect in Jerusalem, was also an archaeologist of some distinction, although he was not formally trained. He decided that he wanted to dig to find out what the truth was. Now, his rival in this was a friend and also one of the most famous British generals of the time, whose name was Charles Gordon, Gordon of Khartoum. And Gordon believed that the Holy Sepulchre, which was dominated by other Christian sects, the Protestants didn't have a piece of it, was all hooey, and he believed that the true place of Jesus' resurrection and burial and crucifixion was outside of the city. Today, it's called the Garden Tomb. There's no archaeological basis for this whatsoever. There are not even any first-century tombs there, but it became a tradition, as happens in Jerusalem. Meanwhile, Conrad Schick dug around the Holy Sepulchre and determined, based on what he found, that the walls of Jerusalem actually were east of the Holy Sepulchre. That bolstered the ancient claim that this was in fact the site of the death of Jesus. But by the 1890s, one of the great questions that had not been answered was, where are the lost palaces and tombs and sacred treasures from the days of David and Solomon? Now, of course, King David was credited with being the Israelite leader who arrived in Jerusalem, conquered it, and his son Solomon then glorified the city, turned it into the bustling center of a very well-to-do empire for a brief span, but the Bible's very clear about this. So for Europeans, the understanding was, well, if we dig, we're going to find all this great stuff that's mentioned in the biblical text. And here's Solomon's tomb as envisioned, for example, by a European in the 19th century. You know, the idea was there were huge structures. Solomon is the very epitome of wealth. So where is this stuff? But the trouble was, archaeologists didn't even know where this original city was. It didn't seem to lie in this pink area, which is the old city. Question is, where is the original city? And these guys, Bliss and Dickey, I always confuse them because with their droopy mustaches, they look so remarkably similar. They began to dig. They were British archaeologists. Well, actually, Bliss was American and Dickey was British, although they were working for the British. They began to dig here on Mount Zion, which is outside of the walls. And after a year or two of that, digging deep tunnels, they found no evidence. And then they moved to here, this little tongue of land that sticks out from the city's Acropolis. And here they hit a kind of pay dirt. They determined using the pottery, looking at the pottery they found, that they'd found some very, very ancient material that you didn't find elsewhere. So this clearly was the ancient city of David. But still missing were these treasures, the temple treasures, such as the Ark of the Covenant to the right, which the Bible said held the 10 Commandments. So this drew a whole generation of treasure hunters. So you want to know where Raiders of the Lost Ark came from? This is the origin. And this story, I found to be astonishing. So in the early 1900s, this British aristocrat named Montague Parker hooked up with this Finnish theologian who believed he had cracked a code in the book of Ezekiel that said exactly where the temple treasures were to be found, including the Ark of the Covenant. So Parker managed to rope in lots of Americans and Brits and gathered lots of money, promising they were going to find this treasure, which was worth billions, possibly $4 billion in today's dollars on the art market. And he set out for Jerusalem with a very odd team that included, and you can't make this up, a Swiss psychic, a cricket star, and a Belgian Congo steamboat captain. Now, they neglected to hire an archaeologist because they really weren't interested in doing science. They just wanted to find the treasure. So eventually, after digging for a couple of years, they found nothing. And so Parker made the foolish decision to bribe the head of the Temple Mount, the noble sanctuary, the Muslim compound, to allow these men to go in at night dressed as Arabs and to get access to the rock beneath the Dome of the Rock, so the big golden dome. Now, this is a sacred site both for Jews as well as for Muslims and for Christians as well, for many reasons. So at night, they went in and were hacking away at this ancient stone. When they were discovered and chased out of town, they barely got away with their lives. Now, it didn't end there, because this created an enormous international crisis, because Muslims in the British Empire were infuriated that somebody who was British had desecrated their sacred site in Jerusalem and attempted to take treasures that they believed did not belong to the British. And this almost brought down the Ottoman Empire as well, the Ottoman government, because the Ottoman government had been in on this, and there was an entire day spent in Istanbul in the parliament debating whether or not the government should pay for being a part of this scandal. Now, in the end, I think the most important aspect of this is that why it matters is that Arab Muslims got a message from this. And the message was the Ottomans could not protect their holy site, the noble sanctuary. And so this, in a way, according to some scholars, was really the kernel, the beginning of an Arab-Palestinian sense, a sense of nationalism. Because, hey, the Ottomans can't protect it, we have to. And that came just at the time when Palestinian Arab nationalism was starting to sprout. So this had enormous consequences down the line in the 20th century. Now, at the same time, for the first time, Jewish explorers were entering the picture. So, many Jews in Europe had been reading the newspaper accounts about all these famous British and French Christians who were digging up Jerusalem. And they suddenly realized, wait a second, this is our heritage. Why are these Christians digging these things up? Why are they in the field? So Baron Edmond de Rothschild, a famous French aristocrat and banker, he funded an expedition to try and beat Parker and find the Ark of the Covenant. And he also failed to do this. The team did not find anything of note except for a couple of tombs they claimed to be the tombs of David and Solomon, but nothing really valuable was found. And at that point, most archaeology, all archaeology halted because World War I began. And that was the beginning of an entirely new era in Jerusalem's history. And so just briefly, most of you know this, but 1917, the British finally, after all these decades of trying to control Jerusalem, they managed to conquer it, take it from the Ottomans, and they were in charge. Of course, it turned into a kind of poison pill because as Jewish immigration increased during the 1920s and 30s, and particularly in the aftermath of the Holocaust in the 1940s, the British decided to throw in the towel. When they withdrew, of course, Israel was created and Jerusalem was divided following a bloody conflict between Israel and Jordan. Now, the old city was left in Jordanian territory, Jordanian-controlled territory, while West Jerusalem was part of Israel, was in fact the capital of Israel at the time. Now, this changed again in a big way in 1967 when the old city fell to the Israelis. So at this point, the British and French Christians who had dominated archaeology in Jerusalem suddenly gave way to a whole new generation of Israeli Jewish archaeologists who for the first time got access to the old city and the area around it. And what they found was both predictable and astonishing and controversial, because this archaeologist on the left, Benjamin Mazar, who was the head of Hebrew University, a very distinguished academic in Israel at the time, he set out to dig in the area around the base of the Temple Mount, just south of the Wailing Wall, which then was renamed the Western Wall. And what he found was clear evidence of the magnificence of Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, the time of Herod the Great, who was appointed by the Romans and who turned Jerusalem into a classic Roman-style city that was very beautiful and became a tourist center as well as a pilgrimage center during that brief period in the late 1st century BCE and the Roman destruction of 70 CE. So he found evidence, for example, of this tremendous pedestrian interchange, the largest pedestrian interchange in the ancient world, and other such finds, which confirmed what many people knew and had argued, that Jerusalem was an important Judean and Jewish city 2,000 years ago. But archaeology can sometimes surprise you. And this was the case when Meyer Ben Dov, who was a colleague of Mazar, began to dig, was digging south of the Acropolis. So you see here, and here's Meyer Ben Dov here in the blue shirt. You see here the Dome of the Rock. Okay, so here's the Temple Mount, the Noble Sanctuary, the Dome of the Rock, Al-Aqsa Mosque, which of course is still there. But what Ben Dov found were the foundations of these tremendous buildings, and no one knew what they were at first. And when he did some dating and some research into the materials, he discovered these were early Islamic palaces. Now, this was a shock because most historians had assumed that Jerusalem was important religiously for Muslims, but that it never played a very much of a political role, and particularly in those early centuries. But this really contradicted that, and it showed that Jerusalem was in fact an important political center at the very inception of Islam. So this was such a controversial find that when Ben Dov went to one of his colleagues and told him what he'd found, the colleague's response, and this comes right from Ben Dov, the colleague's response was, "Do you have a bulldozer?" Ben Dov said, "Sure, I have a bulldozer." And his colleague said, "Then destroy it quickly now." Now, Ben Dov, as an honorable archaeologist, did no such thing. Instead, he went to a radio station and announced the find so he could be sure that nothing was disturbed. But it gives you a feel for how finding something that was built 600, 700, 800 years ago could be so deeply controversial. And speaking of controversy, here is the story very briefly told, because I want to wrap it up so that we can get to some questions and answers. Here is the Western Wall Tunnel. Now, many of you have visited the Western Wall tunnels. It is located just to the north of the Western Wall. If you see my cursor there, there's the Western Wall. And this was a tunnel that was dug all the way to the Via Dolorosa, all along the foundation of the Western Wall. And this was a tremendous engineering feat, but it also had its problems. First, it was done in secret at first. It was done by rabbis with very, very little archaeological oversight. So we really don't know what was there. A lot of important scientific information was almost certainly lost. And it also sparked violence. Now, originally, the idea was you build this tunnel, Jews could go worship there and not be tempted to go up on the Temple Mount, the Noble Sanctuary, which is under Muslim authority, although under Israeli security force. So this became a problem because the tunnel was built beneath the Muslim quarter largely. And Muslims were really upset, as they had been 100 years before, because they believed that this work was endangering the foundations of their homes and some of the important medieval Islamic buildings there. So by the time the end of the tunnel was opened on the Via Dolorosa, there were enormous riots, and more than 100 people died, thousands were injured, and it really marked the beginning of the end of the Oslo peace process, which was underway in the 1990s in an attempt to create a Palestine that could live in peace with Israel. So you can see again how archaeology, or let's just say digging beneath the streets of Jerusalem, has a tremendous effect on the religion and politics of the region. And by the way, that's Rabbi Getz at the top left, who was kind of the mastermind behind this tunnel that you can visit today. Now, in the 1990s, the thing was the city of David. This question of where the city of David was remained almost an embarrassment, because here's one of the most important moments in Jerusalem's history, when the Israelites take it over, and when, according to the biblical text, the city is turned into this glittering center of a short-lived empire. Where was it? Where were the remains? And archaeologists have been digging for well over a century, and they found lots of material from later Judean times. So they found material prior to the destruction by Babylonian forces in 586 BC. They'd also found lots of stuff from the Bronze Age, from the millennium before. So say around 1500 to 1800 BC, there was evidence of large towers being built, large systems of to move water through underneath the city. I mean, it was clear that it was an important city before, and it was an important city after, but where were the remains of David and Solomon? So in 2005, Benjamin Mazar's granddaughter, Eilat Mazar, who unfortunately passed away in May, one of Israel's really important archaeologists for this and the past century, she uncovered a building that she believed was the Palace of David. Now, this is highly controversial among archaeologists because the dating of the material remains problematic, and most of her colleagues were not convinced. But it became international news. Here was the Palace of David. And of course, journalists sometimes, and I can say this as a journalist, sometimes don't get into the nitty-gritty detail of archaeology. And so the impression was given that, in fact, this palace had been found. But instead, it does remain a controversial issue. And we still don't know exactly where this city of David was. It remains a source of great contention, which has political and as well as religious ramifications. And speaking of political and religious ramifications, this is one of the surprises that archaeology has recently given us. A tunnel was bored beneath what's called the city of David, or Wadi Hilwa, as it's known for the Arabs who live there. And the idea was to expose a Roman-era step street, this monumental street that people had suspected existed, but nobody had actually dug to find. And as they began to build a kind of subway-sized tunnel up the slope, because originally this led up the Temple Mount, they were gathering data such as coins. And the archaeologists recently determined, this is just a year or two ago, that in fact, this street was not built at the order of Herod the Great. It was not built in his time at all. It was built much later. And it was not even built by a Jewish leader. It was built by the person who is considered one of the great villains by both Christians and Jews, that is Pontius Pilate. But it was clear from the coins that this street was largely built and completed during his reign. And this really gives us a sense of how archaeology can upend some of our traditional ideas about the Romans. The Romans have long been considered, a kind of ancient Nazis in Jerusalem. But this gives a more nuanced picture of a man who likely wanted to glorify Jerusalem and the temple, the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, which also would reflect back some glory onto him, of course. But I think it paints a really interesting picture of the way Romans and Jews were getting along in the decades prior to the Roman destruction. Now, one of the controversies around this is not just scientific, but it's political, because digging beneath this largely Muslim quarter has caused lots of issues. But let me get to that in a moment. I do want to mention this important dig that's right across the street from the City of David National Park. You can see here the Dome of the Rock at the top left. And if you drop down, moving south, here's the area that Mazar excavated. And then below that, across the street, is the Givati parking lot, one of the few open spaces left in the area around Jerusalem that is being dug right now by Yuval Godot, who's sitting here looking reflective on his chair. And what they found, he and his co-director and the team that found it, it's really extraordinary, from Byzantine coins to images of Athena that were found so close to the Temple Mount, as well as other animal images, which seem kind of counterintuitive, given that this is very, very close to the center of Jewish worship. And the taboo of images was quite strong in the early centuries BC. So this is really giving us new light on Jerusalem that shows the complexity of the society that wasn't just tied to Jewish law, but also had foreigners coming in and out, and maybe locals who were living a different life than we might expect. So this is the kind of dig that's giving us the first archaeological remains from these important periods, about which we know very little aside from what is in the biblical text. And finally, I just want to say that the more things change in Jerusalem, the more they stay the same. I mean, that's what I discovered at the end of my long journey beneath the streets and above the streets as well. I mean, what I learned was that digging below was and is part of the conflict above. I mean, what's happening now really is very similar to what happened 150 years ago. You still have the Arab complaints of buildings being damaged by those digging below. You still have patrons who have strong political and religious agendas, such as David Barry on the right there, who's the head of the City of David Foundation, or Elad, who is dedicated not just to unearthing the ancient Roman street and doing good archaeology, but also to settling Jews into what is primarily an Arab Muslim neighborhood, which is quite controversial. And of course, there's been lots of violence in that area. Now, there's also a conflict over how to interpret scientific data, because you find data and it doesn't necessarily tell you a story. It gives you information. But from the beginning, Jerusalem has been a place where archaeological data is used in the religious and political wars that have riven this city for so long. And I think it's just something to keep in mind that archaeology is a science, but the science in Jerusalem, and I would argue in most places, is really closely tied to the politics and religious issues that you encounter. So to wrap up, and then we'll get to questions, my big surprise in following this thread of archaeology in the Holy City is that Western Christians who were looking for biblical remains not only were attempting to capture Jerusalem and control it from above, they also helped to inspire and fuel Zionism, and in turn create Israel, and of course, played a role in today's conflict. So the other issue that I won't get into, but I'm happy to discuss is it ethical for archaeologists to dig up biblical Jerusalem? And we can talk about that, international law versus Israeli law, but the point is that it is not simply, and it's not an easy issue to discuss, but it's something that I think is worth talking about. And finally, I did have a sense of hope, and that is that there are very, very strict narratives that govern people's views of Jerusalem, in my experience. But my hope would be that the archaeology that's been done, even as it's been used by politicians and religious leaders, it can offer a way for us to see a nuance and for us to see Jerusalem in all of its glorious complexity. And then in doing so, I think we can probably give Jerusalem a little more credit and really understand that the three faiths that are there have helped and fed and cooperated with each other as much as they've been in conflict. So with that, I'd like to give my thanks to National Geographic, which helped support this, as well as Simon Norfolk, who I mentioned, and of course, Jerusalem's archaeologists and residents. And I would love to take some questions.
All right, Andrew, thank you very much. We do have quite a few questions coming in.
Excellent.
I'm going to start it off with this one, though. So were you, and I'm also inspired by the tone of some of the comments and questions that are coming in, were you afraid to take on such a contentious topic? Like where no matter where you fall on the issue, someone is going to fault your perspective?
Oh, absolutely. You know, I had to be dragged kicking and screaming to Jerusalem, I assure you. I've written a lot about archaeology for the past 20 years and in many places, and I avoided Jerusalem for that very reason, because it seems so complicated, and whatever you say, somebody's going to criticize you, and who needs that? But I guess as I've gotten older, I've gotten less wise, and I've realized that when I made that visit with Israel Finkelstein, who's a famous Israeli archaeologist, I realized during that tour that this is what makes Jerusalem so unique and interesting to me, is that it's a place where science and religion and politics all come together. And that is, to me, really interesting, and it's something to move toward. So yeah, I had to move through a lot of reluctance in order to take this on. And you know, I did the best I could to try and be as clear and as even-handed as possible.
And how has the feedback been?
Well, to my surprise, the word even-handed has been used in several reviews. So I'm really happy. And those people in Israel that were very helpful, I've gotten good feedback from them. So, you know, I'm sure everyone has a different point of view. It's not Jerusalem if you don't have different points of view in play. But I hope this can at least get a good conversation going about the nature of science and religion and politics. It's just something that is so critical for understanding our world today.
This is a question, I think, that goes back to the beginning of your talk when you were talking about the tomb found by de Saulcy. Was the tomb ever returned to Israel?
Great question. I did not plant this question. In fact, there's an article and cover story in Biblical Archaeology Review that I just wrote in this past issue, which addresses this. Now, this was the first dig, right? In 1863, this Frenchman went and dug and took the sarcophagus and the bones back to the Louvre, enraging the Jewish residents of Jerusalem. Now, the story didn't end there, because a woman in France who was Jewish managed to purchase this site not long after. And what happened then is a little fuzzy. Now, the French government claims that it was then turned over to the French government. So now a French flag flies over this site in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, just north of the old city. And it's a tourist site that France has controlled for more than 100 years. But just about 3 or 4 years ago, a group of Israeli rabbis got together and they are suing the French government. Number one, they want the sarcophagus back from the Louvre. Number two, they want the bones, which the Louvre at this point says they've lost, they don't have any record of, they don't know where it is. And finally, they want this Tomb of the Kings returned to the Jewish people. And this is a source of enormous contention between France and Israel right now. Already relations have been a bit rocky between the two countries, and this has really thrown both sides for a loop, because it's a very complicated legal question of what happened back in the 1860s and 70s and 80s. And we'll see what happens. But the two court cases, one against the French government and one against the Louvre, are now underway in Paris.
Okay, here's a question about the tunnel north from the Kotel. Was it created by Israel or was it ancient and uncovered by them?
Good question. So we're talking about the Western Wall tunnel that extends the length of the foundation. Now, if you remember that little video clip I showed of when Charles Warren was digging, that is part of the Western Wall tunnel that is possibly partly was natural, but then it was dug out. When exactly is not clear, maybe during the Hasmonean period prior to the Romans, maybe a little bit later. There's debate about that. But yes, that part was ancient, but the bulk of that tunnel was bored straight alongside the Western Wall from 1967 until the 1990s.
Here's a question about what was the state of archaeology in Jerusalem from 1948 to 1967?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, that was still the time when the Jordanians controlled the area. They continued to allow mainly British archaeologists to work. So Kathleen Kenyon, who's one of the great archaeologists of the 20th century, she dug in Jericho for a long time. She came to Jerusalem and she was actually digging right up to and after the 1967 war. She was digging there at the city of David, again, looking for the evidence of David and Solomon. So there was some digging that went on. And there's a great story when Kathleen Kenyon was finished with her dig. She took her old Pontiac that she and the dig team used, and they buried it just inside the old walls of the old city. This is a tradition that archaeologists have. You bury something modern so that when archaeologists come in 100 years from now, they'll know you were there. So she actually put her car there and buried it. And that really was the end of Western archaeology in Jerusalem.
Two questions about Hezekiah's tunnel. Has it been verified by archaeologists?
Yeah, so Hezekiah's tunnel runs beneath the city of David, or Wadi Hilwa. And it is, there's a plaque that was found in the 1880s by a couple of Arab boys who were playing hooky. And this plaque it's really one of the most fascinating inscriptions found in the ancient Middle East, because it says on it, oh, we guys here were digging this tunnel and we came together at this point. It's not a royal inscription, it's not by Hezekiah, but it really shows that people were literate in that period, and in the, say, 8th century or so BC, and that the tunnel was in fact built during that era. Now, people long thought that Hezekiah built that tunnel because there was going to be a foreign invasion and they needed to have a place to move the water, to keep the water safe from invaders. But increasingly, archaeologists believe that this tunnel actually was built a little bit later. It was built a little bit earlier, and it probably was copying what was being done in ancient Assyria at that time when people were starting to build enormous waterworks. Because it clearly took a long time for them to build it. It wasn't something that was built in an emergency. It took them years and years to do this project.
Has there been any archaeological exploration under the Dome of the Rock since the 1911 failed British effort?
As far as I know, no, there's not been any kind of formal archaeology. Now, there may have been some minor work done when, say, electrical wires are placed or something, infrastructure happens. Sometimes they're very, very small digs, but as far as I know, no, there have not been any even minor digs within the Dome of the Rock. And there's been very, very few digs that have been done on the entire platform itself, with one major exception that I'll get into now, but it involved the controversial dig at what was known as Solomon's, the Solomon's Cellars, basically, what's now a mosque. But that's a whole chapter in my books that I could point you to for more detail.
Okay, has there been any movement towards using SAR, S-A-A-R, or imaging to see what is actually under Jerusalem?
It's a great question. The problem with using radar images is that it's great if you're out in a desert and you don't have a lot of disturbed soil. But because Jerusalem is a city, it's very, very hard to see below. You have so many layers, as I described. And this is one of the reasons why Jerusalem remains so largely unknown. In fact, most of the digs going on in Jerusalem are not being done by Israeli archaeologists. They're being done by people in the old city, many of whom are Muslim and Christian Arabs, who are just digging down to add a basement, to add a room for a new kid. And this is going on mostly surreptitiously. It's very hard to track this from space, or even if you're on the ground.
Okay, is the notion that the city of David was not on the Temple Mount a new one?
Well, it's not new. Because we have so little data, you can say the city of David was anywhere. In fact, Israel Finkelstein recently proposed that the city of David was located beneath what is now the Temple Mount. And then in Herod's time, that area was enlarged and the old city that had been there was destroyed. So there'd be no find in it anymore. Now, that's as good as any guess because we have so little information, and the dating is so difficult. It's so hard to tell if something was dated 950 BC or 900 BC. So until we get better technology and better dating methods, I think this is going to remain a contentious point. We don't have a single building from that Davidic era.
And this question is saying, why would we expect to find any remains from Solomon's temple since the city was sacked and the Babylonians likely removed anything of value?
Well, one reason would be that yes, it's one thing to knock down a building and steal the stuff, but usually the foundations remain. So in fact, what was interesting to me is that there is absolutely no physical evidence that we have either of Solomon's temple or even of the temple that Herod renovated. And this is not a controversial point. This is accepted by archaeologists, that because we haven't had any digs, we don't have any physical evidence. Now, there's evidence of the compound, other buildings that were on that compound, just as the Dome of the Rock is only one element of today's Acropolis. So we really don't have much in the way of knowledge beyond the biblical text and some other texts to really guide us. So we just don't know.
Could you please comment on some of the finds from the city of David areas written in ancient Hebrew bearing the names of kings and other persons mentioned in the Bible?
Sure. This is something that Elat Mazar, who I mentioned, she uncovered lots of very important seals, for example. They're stamp seals like ancient signatures that did belong to very important people who are mentioned in the Bible. I should mention that archaeology in Jerusalem has been criticized by many, both in and outside of Israel, of focusing a little too much on finding the names of people who are in the Bible. The question is, what's important? And the questions have changed in many ways. So yes, they have found the names of people who were in the Bible, but many archaeologists say, well, so what? It's more important to know how people were living, what kind of diseases were affecting them, what did they eat, who were they trading with? These are kind of the modern questions that archaeology tends to want to answer, rather than to simply find another seal that mentions yet another kind of obscure scribe who's mentioned in the Bible.
A question about whether you interacted with any Palestinian archaeologists.
Good question. Well, in Jerusalem, it is not legal for Palestinians to dig, because to dig, they would have to get a license from the Israeli Antiquities Authority. And all of the archaeologists I met were all Israeli Jews who had those licenses. There are Israeli Arabs who are archaeologists, but I never met one that was working inside of Jerusalem. So there are Palestinian archaeologists, but they would work in the West Bank areas that are under Palestinian Authority control. They're a very small group. There's not many of them. They don't have much funding, and they haven't been able to do much in the way of research in the past 30 or 40 years. But there are several of them, and they keep abreast of what's going on in Jerusalem.
Okay, someone is saying, in a webinar about Jerusalem, I understood that there is a great controversy about some of the claims because the architectural practices that were used are not best practice. It was something about digging horizontally versus vertically. And I know you talk a lot about that in your book. So if you could maybe briefly address that.
Yeah, this is one of the peculiar things about Jerusalem. So tunnels were used in the very beginning of archaeology, when it was not quite a science, it was more exploration. People tunneled, but then quickly they realized by the late 1800s that if you tunnel, it's kind of like driving without having peripheral vision, that you can't see what's to your right or to your left. And as a result, you don't have a good sense of what is going on, of the dating, of relating material. It's better to dig straight down, and as you go, you're carefully seeing the layers. But if you tunnel, you're missing everything that's above you and below you. So tunneling went out of fashion very quickly. But in Jerusalem, for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's so densely populated. There's not much, you can't really go straight down in many places. Number two, because it was religiously and politically controversial to dig. If you're digging a tunnel, people can't see you. So it was a way of hiding what you're doing. That was definitely true for the British. And today, tunneling continues essentially for the same reasons, because it's a good way to do your work without disturbing people above. And it's also a way to do work possibly I wouldn't say hide things, but I would say to maintain a certain control, because you can control what's underground. It's harder to control what's above. So in some ways, Jerusalem is unique as a city because there's no other place that is doing this kind of tunneling aside from subways being built in different cities, but that's a different matter.
I know you talk about the search for the Ark of the Covenant in your book, and someone is asking, some people believe it's buried where the temple was. What do you think?
Where the temple was?
That the Ark of the Covenant is buried where the temple was.
Oh, right. Well, I'm less interested in where the Ark of the Covenant might be than in why people are so obsessed and fascinated by this one particular object. There's so many objects that are mentioned that are sacred in the Bible, but this has really captured people's attention. And I would point to Parker. I think Parker was the first person to go and look for it. And there were international headlines, and this really spurred this fascination, but it's not based on any kind of real historical evidence. Now, it's true that there was a Jewish sage or two who suggested in medieval times that maybe it survived and maybe it's beneath the Temple Mount, maybe it was hidden. But the fact is that this is a small box that was lost at least sometime around 586 BC, which was never mentioned in the biblical text after its one or two mentions. it's not given a lot of play. There's no hint in the biblical text that it survives or was hidden or had special powers that continued on beyond the Babylonian invasion. So I think it says more about our 20th century fixation on treasure hunting and on Hollywood than it does on the true search for the ancient past.
Well, I think that's a good place to leave it. I see another question about will this talk be recorded and available on YouTube? The answer to that is yes. It will be available in a couple of weeks. And I'd like to thank you, Andrew, for presenting this talk tonight and taking these questions.
Thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure.
And I encourage everyone to read the book for a deeper dive into the topic.
And I hope you all had a happy Hanukkah.
Thank you. Have a good night.
All right, farewell.
Bye.